Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Weller and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Now the topic for today is about monsters and monster lore, and if you haven't figured it out, I'm going to go over hook horror monster lore for Dungeons and Dragons. Now I'm going to say hooked horror a lot. Although the actual name is hook horror, I'm going with hooked horror just because it flows off the tongue easier for me than trying to say it the other way. So if you were wondering what's going on, that's the only reason why I'm doing it. No other reason, so don't get too upset when you see me pronouncing it slightly differently or adding in the D. The hooked horror is a large bipedal monstrosity which dwells in the underground caverns under the ground and subterranean locations in the underdark. It looks like a cross between a vulture, a beetle, and a humanoid that has hooks instead of hands. Also known as the vulture beak, the hacker, and the cave dweller, the hooked horror is a terrifying monster, truly. The hooked horror stands about 9 feet tall and weighs between 350 and 400 pounds. A hooked horror has a tough, mottled grey exoskeleton that is of an insect or a beetle. The 4 limbs that it has, or the front limbs should I say, these limbs of the hooked horror, they end in a 12-inch long hook, so it's quite dangerous if they were to actually get into your flesh. The hooked horror's legs end in feet that have 3 very short short, sharp, curved claws at the end. The head of the hooked horror is shaped like that of a vulture, including the hooked beak that the vulture has as well. It is thought that the hooked horror is a distant or potentially related in some way to the cockroach and the cave cricket. Not sure if that's in fact the case. Hooked horrors do have a smell that most humanoids can't actually detect, but many animals with a keen sense of smell or a good nose might be able to detect something such as a dry, musty odour when this thing is around. Now, the biology of the hooked horror is actually pretty good. I found that there wasn't very much missing, but I filled in all the gaps that you needed. This is a really odd invertebrate arthropod. The hooked horror is unlike any creature seen in Dungeons and Dragons or any kind of Dungeons and Dragons world. It's very, very strange. Hooked horrors have an acute hearing and are rarely surprised, but they also have a keen sense of smell to go with that. The eyes of the hooked horror are multifaceted, like that of an insect, but they're also very sensitive to light, particularly bright light, and they are actually blind in normal light. But then again, they don't really use their eyes to detect anything, so it won't really matter too much. The vulture-like hooked horror is especially susceptible to disease and parasites due to the molting process of its natural armour, and I'll explain more about that in the future. The expected lifespan of the hooked horror is 40 or less years, so they don't live a long time. The chitinous exoskeleton on the back of the hooked horror is extremely thick, and it's also covered with some sharp studs. So yeah, you don't want to grab onto this thing because you'll probably hurt yourself. Over a period of about 2 days, a hooked horror will molt that hard exoskeleton as it grows bigger. And usually this results in the shell flaking off and revealing a soft new exoskeleton. It takes some time for the new hooked horror exoskeleton to actually harden. So it starts soft, it hardens over time, and during this period of time it leaves it vulnerable to injuries, predators, and disease and parasites, which I was just talking about before. The hooked horror communicates in a series of clicks and clanks made by the exoskeleton near the throat that has a sort of like a hollow cavity in it. But another aspect to the hooked horror's communication is not just that part there. They actually rub their hooks together and they bang them on rocks to communicate as well, something that sometimes is not completely obvious. Sounds made by the hooked horror can be used to estimate a cave's size and their distance from anything, basically. It's much like sonic radar or echolocation that a bat would have. So that's how the hooked horror actually sees things. It's by sound. The bald head of the hooked horror keeps the head clean while feeding and plays an important role in thermoregulation. So it's basically releasing heat through its head, otherwise it would sort of overheat. The beak of the hooked horror is made up of curtain. It's a special protein that allows the beak to grow strong enough to support the creature's feeding activities. And you'll find that a lot of birds have curtin is a protein in their beaks as well. The reason that the hooked horror's beak is curved is because the monstrosity will be using it to rip the flesh open off its victim or its prey, and also to crush bones. So it's a very strong beak, and that's why it's curved, is for that very purpose, for ripping flesh off. There is a gland in the hooked horror's abdomen that produces a special enzyme that renders the creature immune to the poisonous effects of eating something like a shrieker, a violet fungus, phyconoids, which is a strange creature in itself, and then zygomes. These are sort of like underground or subterranean, underdark creatures that are more of a plant nature than anything else. If you cut the head off the hooked horror, the nerves in the neck send a burst of electricity to the muscles down its body, telling the creature to move for a short time. So you have the same sort of effect as if you were to cut the head off a chicken. When you cut off the head off a chicken, it doesn't seem to die straight away. It sort of runs around and flaps a bit in circles, and then finally it carks it. And that sort of thing can happen with a hooked horror as well. Now, when it comes to combat for the hooked horror uses their extremely accurate hearing to track and locate its prey. The hooked horror always knows their territory extremely well, and they try to ambush unsuspecting travellers or denizens or anything that they can potentially eat. Battle tactics for a hooked horror are very simple. It drops from above, onto its target or prey. It then uses its hooks to cause wounds and to hold the victim or creature, while it uses its beak to rip meat from the creature, and basically it eats you alive. Since the hooked horror's eyesight is so poor, they suffer no penalty to combat or movement in any way if they are blinded or in complete darkness. So their sight plays no part into how they can move around and how they fight. Attacks from the hooked horror are silent, and opponents rarely have time to call for help when they do attack. Hooked horrors are natural cave climbers, as their hooks give them excellent purchase on rock surfaces. A hooked horror can move at normal speed up a vertical surface that is not sheer. As long as it's not a sheer surface, it can move up at normal speed. But even if it is a sheer surface, it can still move up there. It'd just be a bit slower. The great weight of the hooked horror means that it cannot hang from the ceiling like other insects can. But this might not be completely true, as some of the sages are conflicting in terms of the information they provide on the hooked horror's ability to fight from the ceiling. I think they might in fact be able to do something like this. The habitat and society of the hooked horror. The obvious penalties for having hooks instead of hands is that a hooked horror cannot use weapons or any kind of tools, although their hooks are kind of like a weapon and they can be used a bit like a tool as well. The hooked horror can only pick up items in their beak, and this severely restricts their ability to amass a large treasure hoard if you are hoping for one. A clan of hooked horrors generally lives in caves and underground warrens. The lair entrance of a hooked horror is usually up a vertical rock wall or a sloped rock wall of some kind. Each hooked horror family unit in the clan has its own small cavern off from the main central cavern. The hooked horror produces or reproduces by laying a 3-inch egg that looks like a rock, which the parents scatter around the cavern to camouflage the eggs with the other rocks that are there. The clan's eggs are kept in the safest, most defensible place to ensure the young hooked horror survive. A hooked horror hatches from an egg after about 6 months, and this will produce a 1-foot tall baby. After 1 year, the hooked horror will be about 5 feet high and will reach its full size after 17 years. Generally, a hooked horror stays with its parents for the first 3 years before leaving the nest. A hooked horror will seek out a mate from about the age of 6 years or older. The clan is usually ruled by the eldest hooked horror female, who never participates in combat because they are simply too valuable. The eldest male frequently is the mate of the clan ruler or leader, and they take charge of all of the hooked horror hunting and any other kind of combat situations, and is usually considered the war chief. Members of a hooked horror clan rarely fight with each other because it doesn't sort of benefit them in any way. The hooked horror might quarrel or not cooperate in some way, but they rarely come to blows with each other. Clans sometimes fight each other under rare circumstances, but only if there is a bone of contention, such as the hooked horror's territorial dispute situation, where territory is being fought over. So it's quite rare for this to happen, though. It is rare for the clan of a hooked horror to want to rule large areas or conquer other clans. So they don't wage war as such. Hooked horrors have a poor relationship with all other species or races, but in the circumstances where they might be enslaved by drow or other creatures, this can change. As a result of living in a subterranean location and in the underdark, the hooked horror might also be able to speak undercommon with the right influence, although it's more likely that they understand the language rather than they can speak it. And you probably need to get them when they're very young from an egg, otherwise it's not going to really work. I think it would be particularly difficult for a hooked horror to communicate in undercommon, but they may be able to understand small phrases that have been taught to them if you get them very, very young. Although the hooked horror don't attack foolishly, like they would not attack a strong party. Generally, though, other creatures are considered meat. The hooked horror retreat when faced with a strong group, and hooked horrors do not recognize or understand indebtedness or gratitude. So, in fact, their simple language of the hooked horror doesn't even have a term for this concept whatsoever. They don't understand it. There isn't a term. Just because a character saves the life of a hooked horror doesn't mean that it will feel grateful or return that favour in any way. They don't have alliances with other races and creatures generally. Beyond the world of Toril, some hooked horrors were known to be found on the planet of Orith, but other than that seems to be the only place that you will find these creatures. Now, the ecology of the hooked horror. Although the hooked horror are basically omnivores, they actually prefer meat. Now that doesn't mean that they can't eat flora or vegetation, but they do prefer meat. The hooked horror can eat just about any kind of cave-dwelling fungus, plants, lichen, or some of the other animals that feed off those things. Certainly they will eat animals. When possible, a hooked horror will collect and eat silver and electrum, potentially even platinum because there's silver in it, and that will pass through its digestive system. Why the hooked horror does this, in terms of what is the purpose, no one really knows, unfortunately. Silver and electrum items remain unaffected except for a slight odour that is left when the hooked horror performs a waste dump. So in other words, when it poos it out, and it's just there, and it has a strange smell. It is rumoured that the hooked horror particularly enjoy eating drow, and probably because the drow have been using the hooked horror in various ways, and so their relationship is not particularly good. There exists a small number of hooked horror colonies that cultivate their own food on farms, but this is extremely rare. And when I say a farm, we're really talking about underground, subterranean plants that they would feed off, rather than the kind of farm that you're kind of used to. In any case, a hooked horror sleeps about half of its day, moving sluggishly when it is not threatened, which means the monster can survive on relatively little food for its size for quite a long time. Hooked horrors are well acclimatized to cave life, so they feel quite at home there. A hooked horror has few natural predators, even underground or in the underdark. They can usually deal with most things. The hooked horror's exoskeleton dries out and becomes too brittle to use after a few months or so. So if you are thinking you kill one of these things, you get the exoskeleton, you're going to use it as armor. It doesn't really work that way. But you can cure the hooked horror's exoskeleton to stop it becoming dry, and it makes excellent armor, and it can fetch up to 450 gold pieces if you're able to do this. My understanding is that the only ones who have really been highly successful in this area are gnomes, dwarves, and drow at this present time. Now, how do you incorporate the hooked horror into your adventures? I want to warn you now, some of these ideas you will consider silly, some of these ideas you will like. You don't need to like all of them, just take the ones that you want. I do need to thank the Dungeon Master Roundtable because they did assist me in providing with many different ideas, and they have a wonderful video up on the channel Dungeon Class that Mark and Gonzo put up there, and I suggest you go and check it out at some point. In other words, let's go into what could we use this monster for. The hooked horror can be a mutated creature by a wizard and it results in a new species, a species that has multiple hooks on the ends of tentacles. Instead of arms, let's give it multiple tentacles with hooks on the end. It's sort of like an aberration of some kind. It's gone over the top. Give it a bit more of a Far Realm feel to it. A kingdom at war discovers that the enemy's secret code is a language that is in fact the hooked horror clanking and clicking. And so they have to go and find a hooked horror, either capture it or negotiate with it, and see if it will reveal the monsters or creatures' odd language to them so that they can decipher the enemy's codes that they're using. So this is a little bit like a Windwalker, I guess, if you know what I mean. Anyway, an underground community of hooked horrors that are fishermen that use or fisher persons or fisher creatures or whatever you want to call them, that use their hooks to skewer fish. I can see there a hooked horror in an underground stream being able to hook up fish quite nicely, probably even better than a bear. Should the characters want to catch a leviathan or a kraken or a giant octopus, they could capture a hooked horror, tie it to a chain and use it as bait, because this bait has kind of got the hooks built in, so make it a little bit easier to catch that large creature. Drows in the Underdark could be breeding the hooked horror on a farm for their delicious meat and the eggs, because the eggs would be quite tasty. You could also have drow cowboys that drive herds of hooked horrors across the Underdark plains for some sort of big ranch outfit. Yeah, I'm taking it from a Western people. What about a kleptomaniac hooked horror that steals silver coins and silver items as food and then poops out the residue as piles of gooey silver waste? Like, it's not my problem how the players try to turn this stuff back into solid metal, but it would be quite amusing, particularly when you have a character who says, I would like to check the hooked horror for treasure. And you say, there's a pile of waste over there, and it looks like it's coloured silver. Anyway, hooked horrors engage in I'm going to go with extreme sports, okay? So I like extreme sports, so we're going to do this. Hooked horrors could engage in a sport involving base jumping off the cliff face or a cliff face, underground, mountain tops, you name it. And they could use a sail or a parachute or even a skin membrane that they have developed on their back that's tucked underneath their arms, and then they could either use this as just a competition sport thing, or they could use it as a tool to descend on anybody without taking any falling damage or injuring themselves and assaulting unsuspecting victims. Like, wouldn't that be fun? I know, I think that would be fun. Anyway, what about the professional world of wrestling or sumo wrestling with hooked horrors? This would be like part of the Underdark events that would be run by, say, a Mind Flayer colony, or even drow matrons who would engage or hire or capture hooked horrors to do wrestling matches. Hey man, we can make a sport out of this, and we can make some money as well. Another final extreme sport, or even use it as a lethal form of warfare in terms of a tactic, and that has have your hooked horrors attached to a springy bungee cord. One, you could, dropping a hooked horror off a bridge or a cliff face or something like that. They descend on their bungee cord, and if it's wartime, you could drop them off the side of a castle wall, and then they would then hook up their enemy and then zoop back up with them, and then they could then throw them over their shoulder or beat them to death. I mean, whatever you want to do. Okay, but extreme sports, I feel like, why can't hooked horrors go bungee jumping too? Okay, let's not leave everybody out, please. Now, how do you defeat the hooked horror? Fighting the hooked horror at range with arrows and spells is probably the smartest strategy because it specializes in close quarter battles and combat. Affecting the mind of the hooked horror with spells is more likely to be successful compared to attacking its armored body because it's got a lot of armor on it. Casting a spell that eliminates sound, like silence, would disrupt the hooked horror's ability to detect a creature because it has very poor eyesight, but it uses its sense of hearing primarily to detect where things are, and that would really mess it up. It would essentially be truly blind at this point by using the silence spell. I would also suggest stay alert and look up. Look up so that a hooked horror doesn't drop on top of you and then injure you from the fall, that using you as a cushion, and then as part of an ambush strategy, then hoe into you with its hooks and tear you to pieces. So yes, stay alert and look up. Anyway, the publication history of the hooked horror is a little bit all over the place. There's a lot of different publications. I'm just going to mention the ones that I think are kind of really important. The first one, originally printed in White Dwarf magazine number 12. You'll find the creature is here. The Fiend folio for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. You'll find that there was printed in 1981. And Dragon magazine number 131 in 1988 had a pretty good layout on how this creature works. Then we get the Monstrous Manual in number 2, second ed edition. So the Monstrous Manual for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, second ed edition in 1993. The Monster Manual number 2 for third ed edition in 2002. And then it was printed again in the Monster Manual for 4E in 2008, and finally we get the Monster Manual for 5E in 2014. So it's followed the entire history of the game, and this is why it's such an important monster to incorporate into your game if you haven't done so. I think you will find it more than useful for scaring the bejesus out of everybody at your table. So let me know if you found this video useful or helpful, and if you did, fantastic. If you have any questions, please ask them, put them in the comments section. If you have any feedback, please provide that. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.